A Scandal in Bohemia. Chapter 1. The King's Mistake. For Sherlock Holmes, there was only one woman in the world. He did not love her because he never loved women. But after their meeting, he never forgot her. Her name was Irene Adler. One night in March, I visited my old friend at his home in Baker Street. I was married by now, so I did not often see him. "Come in, Watson," he said. "Sit down. I'm happy to see you because I've got something to show you." What do you think of this? It arrived in the last post. It was a letter with no date, name, or address. It said, "Tonight, someone will visit you to talk about some very secret business. You have helped other important people, and you can, we hope, help us. Be in your room at 7:45 p.m. The paper. What do you think about the paper?" I tried to think like Holmes. "It's expensive, so this person is rich. It's strange paper." "Yes, it's not English. If you look at it in the light, you can see that it was made in Bohemia. And a German, I think, wrote the letter." "Ah, here comes our man now." We could hear the horses in the street. "Shall I leave, Holmes?" I asked. No, I need your help." "This will be interesting," my friend answered. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," called Holmes. A tall, strong man came into the room. He was wearing expensive clothes and a mask over his face. "You can call me Count von Kram. I come from Bohemia," he said. "My business is most important. Before I tell you about it, do you agree to keep it a secret?" "I do," we said together. "A very important person who belongs to a royal family has sent me to ask for your help," he went on. "I wear a mask because nobody must know who that person is. I must explain how important this business is. If you cannot help, there will be difficulty and trouble for one of the most important families in Europe, and perhaps a very big scandal. I am talking about the famous House of Ormstein, kings of Bohemia." "I know, Your Majesty," said Holmes. He quietly smoked his cigarette. The man jumped up from his chair. "What?" he cried. "How do you know who I am?" Then he pulled the mask off his face and threw it on the ground. "You are right. Why do I hide it? I am the king. I am Wilhelm von Ormstein, king of Bohemia. I came to see you myself, because I could not ask another person to tell my story. It must be a secret. You understand?" "Very well. Go on," said Holmes. He closed his eyes and listened. 5 years ago, I met a woman called Irene Adler. We... "Ah," said Holmes. "Irene Adler, born in 1850, singer, lives in London. A very beautiful woman, I hear." He looked at the king. "You and she... you loved her for a while, and then left her. But before you left her, you wrote her some letters, perhaps. And now you want to get these letters back." "That's right." "Did you marry her?" "No." "If she asks you for money and shows you the letters, You can say that you didn't write them. But, Mr. Holmes, she also has my photograph. You can say that you didn't give her a photograph. We were both in the photograph. Oh, dear. That was a mistake, Your Majesty. I know. I was stupid. But I was very young. You must get the photograph back. Can you steal it from her house? I have tried 5 times. But my men couldn't find it. What can I do? Holmes laughed. This is very interesting. What does she plan to do with the photograph? Soon I am going to marry Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, daughter of the King of Scandinavia. You know, of course, that we are 2 of the most important royal families in Europe. Clotilde will never marry me if she learns that I have been a friend of Irene Adler. You do not know Irene Adler. She is a beautiful woman, but she can be as hard as a man. She was angry when I left her, and so she doesn't want me to marry another woman. I know that she will send this photograph to the Saxe-Meiningen family. And then there will be a terrible scandal. We must find the photograph before she sends it. I am sure that we will find it, said Holmes. You are, of course, staying in London? I will write to you to tell you what happens. And the money? The king put a large, heavy bag on the table. I must have that photograph, he said. There is £1,000 here. If you need more, you must ask at once. The money is not important. And the young woman's address? Asked Holmes. Bryony Lodge, Serpentine Avenue, St. John's Wood, London. Good night, Your Majesty, said Holmes. I hope to have some good news for you soon. The king left, and Holmes turned to me. And good night, Watson. Please come back tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Chapter 2. A Servant Finds Out. When I arrived the next day, Holmes was not there. So I waited in his room. At 4 o'clock the door opened, and a very strange servant came in. He wore old, dirty clothes, and I had to look very hard before I saw that it was my old friend. Holmes, I cried, where have you been? I've had a very good day, he replied with a smile. I've been outside Miss Irene Adler's house. Servants are always happy to talk, and so I have heard a lot about the young woman. For example, she has a good-looking man friend called Godfrey Norton, a lawyer who often visits her. Now, why? If he's her lawyer, perhaps she's already given him the photograph. But if he loves her, she won't show him the photograph. Most interesting, Holmes, I said. While I was there, Mr. Norton himself suddenly arrived. I watched them through the windows. When he left, he jumped into a taxi. To the Church of St. Monica, as fast as you can, he shouted. 2 minutes later, Miss Adler ran out of her house, jumped into another taxi, and called, To the Church of St. Monica, quickly. I couldn't miss this, Watson, so I jumped into a third taxi. When I arrived, I went into the church. Godfrey Norton looked round and saw me. Thank God, he shouted. Come here quickly. Why? I asked. Come on, man, we need you. And so I helped Godfrey Norton to marry Irene Adler. They needed a witness, and a servant from the street was better than nobody. So, she's married him. What shall we do now? I asked. Well, tonight, my dear Watson, I need your help. Will you do what I ask? Without questions? Of course, Holmes, if you think that it's important, I answered. Later, we'll go to Bryony Lodge. Irene Adler, or Irene Norton, will arrive home at 7 o'clock, and she will ask me to go into the house. You must wait outside near the sitting-room window, and when it opens, watch me inside. When I hold up my hand, throw this thing into the room and shout, "Fire!" I took the small thing out of his hand. What is it, Holmes? I asked. It's a smoke stick. The room will very quickly be full of smoke. After that, wait for me at the corner of the street. Right. I'll do what you want, I said. Chapter 3. Fire. That evening Holmes again wore different clothes, and a large black hat. But it was not just the clothes that were different. He changed his face, his hair, everything. He was a different man. We walked together to Serpentine Avenue. Outside the house there were a lot of people who were smoking, laughing, and talking. Holmes and I walked up and down in front of the house. You see, said Holmes to me, I think she doesn't want her new husband to see the photograph. But where is it? At her bank? No, women like to keep important things themselves. I'm sure it's in her house. But the king's men tried to find it, I said. Yes, but they didn't know where to look, said Holmes. But how will you know? I asked. I won't look. She'll show me. She'll have to. Just then a taxi arrived. One of the men in the street ran to open the door. Then another man pushed him. Other men were also pushing and shouting, and a fight began. Irene Norton was in the middle of it. But Sherlock Holmes ran to help her. Then suddenly he fell to the ground, with blood running down his face. Irene Norton hurried to her front door, but she looked back. How kind of him to help me! Is the poor man hurt? She called. He's dead, cried some voices. No, he's only hurt, cried others. Bring him into the sitting-room, she said. Some people carried Holmes into the house. I waited outside the window and watched. I saw how beautiful Irene Norton was. Then Holmes put up his hand, and I threw the smoke stick into the room. Immediately the people in the street and in the house all began to shout fire very loudly. The house was full of smoke. I walked away, and 10 minutes later Holmes came to meet me. Well done, Watson, he said. Have you got the photograph? I asked. I know where it is. She showed me, he answered. But why did she show you? It's easy, he said, and laughed. You saw all those people in the street? I paid them to help us. It wasn't a real fight, and the blood wasn't real. When people shout fire, a woman runs to the most important thing in her house, her baby, her gold, or a photograph. Mrs. Norton ran to find her photograph, which is in a cupboard in the sitting-room. I saw it, but I did not take it. Tomorrow we will go to her house with the king. We'll go very early before she gets up. The king himself can take the photograph from the cupboard, and then we'll go." While Holmes was talking, we were walking home to Baker Street. When we arrived at my friend's house, a young man hurried past us and said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I've heard that voice before," said Holmes to me. He looked down the street. But who was it? Chapter 4. A Photograph. The next day we went to Irene Norton's house with the king. An old servant opened the door. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, and smiled. "Yes," said my friend. He looked very surprised. "Mrs. Irene Norton and her husband left England this morning. They will never come back to this country." "What?" cried Holmes, his face white and angry. "And what about the photograph?" cried the king. We all hurried into the sitting-room. Holmes ran to the cupboard and opened it. Inside was a photograph, not of Irene Adler and the king, but of the beautiful Irene alone. There was also a letter for Sherlock Holmes. We all read it together. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you did it very well. I thought that it was a real fire, and that you were just a kind old man. But after I opened the cupboard, I began to think. I knew about the famous Sherlock Holmes. I knew your address, and I knew that the king asked you to find the photograph. So I quickly dressed as a young man and followed you home to Baker Street. I wanted to find out if you really were Sherlock Holmes. I said good night to you outside your door. My husband and I have decided to leave England. Please tell the king that I shall not show the photograph to anybody. I love my husband, and he loves me, and he is a better man than the king. But here is a different photograph, and the king can keep this photograph if he likes. Irene Norton." "What a woman!" cried the king. "Why didn't I marry her? What a woman!" "A very, very clever woman," said Sherlock Holmes coldly. "I am sorry, your Majesty, that this business has not finished well." "No, no," said the king. "She writes that she will never show the photograph to anybody. I need nothing more than her word. There is no danger for me now. How can I thank you, dear Mr. Holmes?" "I would like just one thing, your Majesty." "Tell me at once what it is," said the king. "This photograph." The king looked at him in surprise. "Irene's photograph?" he cried. "But of course, it is yours." And so there was no terrible scandal in the royal families of Europe, and Sherlock Holmes still has the photograph of the woman who was cleverer than he was.
The Yellow Face. Part 1.
Sherlock Holmes did not like aimless physical exercise, but one spring day I persuaded him to go for a walk with me in the park. We walked for 2 hours, and it was almost 5 when we returned to Baker Street.
"I beg your pardon, sir,"
said our page boy as we entered.
"There was a man waiting for you. He was a very restless gentleman. He walked all around the room saying, 'Isn't Mr. Holmes going to return?' Finally, he left."
You see,
Holmes said to me,
I needed a case, and now I have lost this one because we went for a walk in the park. Hello? That's not your pipe on the table? Well, that man must have a very big problem, because he left his pipe. It is obvious that he likes this particular pipe very much.
How do you know that he likes it very much? I asked.
Well,
Explained Holmes.
I think this pipe costs around 7 and sixpence. Now, look, it has been mended twice with silver bands that probably cost more than the pipe itself. So this man must like his pipe very much, if he prefers to mend it instead of buying a new one with the same money.
Just then, as Holmes was talking, we heard someone walking up the stairs, and then a man walked into the room without knocking.
I beg your pardon,
Said the man.
I should have knocked, but I am very upset, and I need help.
The man then took off his hat and sat down on a chair.
My dear Mr. Grant Munro,
Began Holmes. Our visitor jumped from his chair.
What?
He cried.
You know my name?
if you want to preserve your incognito,
Said Holmes, smiling.
then you should not write your name on the inside of your hat, or else you should turn the inside of your hat away from the person whom you are addressing. Anyway, my friend and I have heard many strange secrets in this room, and we have had the fortune to help many people. Please tell us the facts of your case.
The facts are these, Mr. Holmes.
He said.
I have been married for 3 years, and my wife and I were very happy until last Monday. Suddenly, a barrier appeared between us, and she has become like a stranger to me. I want to know why. But, Mr. Holmes, I am sure that my wife loves me.
Please let me have the facts, Mr. Munro.
Said Holmes with some impatience.
Effie, my wife, was a young widow, only 25 years old when I met her. Her name then was Mrs. Hebron. She went to America when she was very young and lived in the town of Atlanta, where she married a man called Hebron, who was a lawyer. They had one child, but there was a yellow fever epidemic there, and both her husband and child died of it. I have seen his death certificate. After this tragedy, she decided to leave America and come back to England to live with her aunt. I should also mention that her husband left her a large amount of money. This money was invested, and she can live very well with the income from it. She met me after 6 months in England. We fell in love with each other, and we married a few weeks afterwards. I am a hop merchant, and I too have a good income. We rented a nice house in the country near Norbury. There is an inn and 2 houses near our house, and a single cottage across the field in front of our house. Until this recent incident, my wife and I lived very happily there. There is one more thing I should tell you. When we married, my wife put all her money in my name. I did not think this was a good idea, but she insisted. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she came and asked me for some.
Jack,
She said,
when you took my money, you said that if I ever wanted some, I should just ask you.
Certainly, I said. It's your money. How much do you want?
£100,
She said. What for? I asked, very surprised by the large amount.
Oh,
She said playfully.
you said that you were only my banker, and bankers never ask questions, you know.
I was not happy about this because this was the first time that there was a secret between us. I gave her the cheque and forgot about the matter. It may have nothing to do with what happened afterwards, but I thought that I should mention it. Anyway, I told you that there is a cottage near our house. Well, I like walking past that cottage, and last Monday, as I walked past the cottage, I saw an empty van going away from the cottage and furniture in front of the cottage. Someone was finally going to live there. I was looking at the cottage when suddenly I saw a face watching me from an upper window. There was something strange about the face, Mr. Holmes, that frightened me. I was not very near, but there was something unnatural and inhuman about the face. It was yellow and rigid. I walked closer to the house, but the face suddenly disappeared. Then I went to the door and knocked. A tall woman answered the door. I told her that I was her neighbour and asked her if she needed any help.
If we need any help, we'll call you,
she said, and shut the door in my face. That night I did not tell my wife about the strange face and the rude woman, but I did tell her that people were now living in the cottage. That same night, something strange happened. In the middle of the night, when I was not completely asleep, I became aware that my wife was dressed and was leaving the room. She looked very frightened and nervous. I waited for about 20 minutes, and then she returned. "Where have you been, Effie?" I asked as she entered. She moved back quickly with fright.
Are you awake, Jack?
She cried with a nervous laugh. She told me that she had wanted some fresh air, but I did not believe her. What was my wife hiding from me? The next day I had to go to the city, but I was so worried about my wife that I returned early to Norbury at about 1 o'clock. Walking home, I went past the cottage. I stopped for a minute in front of it to look for that strange face. As I stood there, imagine my surprise, Mr. Holmes, when the door suddenly opened and my wife walked out.
Oh, Jack,
She said.
I came here to see if our new neighbours needed anything. Why are you looking at me like that? Are you angry with me?
So, I said, this is where you went during the night.
What do you mean?
She cried. You came here. I am sure of it. Who are these people?
I have not been here before.
I know you are not telling me the truth. I'm going to enter the cottage and discover the truth.
Please don't go in, Jack.
She cried.
I promise that I will tell you everything someday, but if you enter now, you will cause great sadness.
Then she held me tightly, and I tried to push her off.
Trust me, Jack.
She cried.
You will not be sorry. If you come home with me, all will be well. If you force your way into that cottage, our marriage is finished.
I will trust you, I said, if you promise never to come here again. She was greatly relieved. Then, as we started to leave, I looked up, and there was that yellow face watching us out of the upper window. What link could there be between that creature and my wife? After that, everything went well. But one day I returned home early. I discovered that my wife had been to the cottage again, so I went to the cottage. I walked into the house and found no one. But upstairs I found a comfortable room, and on the mantelpiece stood a full-length photograph of my wife. I am sure that our maid had warned them that I was arriving, and they all went away. That is why I didn't find anyone there. When I saw my wife again, I told her that there could be no peace between us until she told me the truth. That was yesterday, Mr. Holmes, and then I decided to come and see you for help.
After hearing this strange story, Holmes sat silent for a few minutes, thinking. Then he said,
Are you sure that the yellow face was a man's face?
Each time I saw it,
he replied.
I saw it from a distance, so I am not sure.
When did your wife ask you for the money?
Asked Holmes.
Almost 2 months ago.
Have you ever seen a photograph of her first husband?
No, there was a great fire in Atlanta after her husband's death, and all her papers were destroyed.
And yet she had a death certificate. Have you ever seen it?
Yes, she got a duplicate after the fire.
Have you ever met anyone who knew your wife in America?
No.
Has she ever talked about visiting America again?
No.
Has she ever received letters from there?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Concluded Holmes.
Now, go back to Norbury, and when you see that those people have returned to the cottage, call us. It will be easy to solve this mystery. Part 2.
Then Mr. Grant Munro left, and Holmes and I discussed the case.
I am afraid that this is a case of blackmail,
said Holmes. And who is the blackmailer? I asked.
Well, it must be that creature with the yellow face. Upon my word, Watson, there is something very attractive about that yellow face at the window, and I would not miss this case for worlds.
Have you got a theory? I asked.
Yes,
Holmes replied.
I think her first husband is in the cottage. This is what I think happened. This woman was married in America. Her husband got a terrible disease. That is why he has that horrible yellow face. She ran away from him at last and came back to England, where she changed her name and started a new life. After 3 years of marriage, she feels safe again. But her first husband, or some unscrupulous woman attached to him, discovers where she lives. They write to her and tell her to send them £100, or they will tell her new husband everything. When her husband tells her that someone is living in the cottage, she knows that they are her blackmailers. In the middle of the night, while her husband is sleeping, she decides to go to the cottage. That night, she is not able to convince her blackmailers to leave her alone, so she returns the next day. That was when her husband saw her coming out of the house. She then promises her husband that she will not return, but she wants to get rid of her blackmailers. She decides to go again, and this time she brings a photograph, which they probably asked her for. Fortunately for her, her maid warns her that her husband is coming, and she and her blackmailers leave the house in time. Now we can do nothing except wait for Mr. Munro to call us, and then we will see if my theory is correct.
We did not have to wait long. After tea, we received a message from Mr. Munro saying,
There are people in the house.
That night, Holmes and I took a train to Norbury. Mr. Munro was waiting for us at the station, and he took us to the cottage. When we arrived there, Holmes asked Mr. Munro if he was sure he wanted to enter the cottage. Mr. Munro said he was sure, and we went to the door of the cottage. As we approached the door, a woman suddenly appeared. It was Effie.
For God's sake, don't, Jack!
She cried.
Trust me!
I have trusted you too long, Effie.
He cried sternly.
Let go of me. My friends and I are going to solve this mystery.
We rushed up the stairs to the lighted room. In one corner there was a desk, and at that desk there appeared to be a little girl. Her face was turned away from us when we entered the room, but we could see she was wearing a red dress and long white gloves. She turned around to us, and I gave a cry of surprise and horror. Her face was the strangest yellow colour, and it had absolutely no expression. A moment later the mystery was explained. Holmes, with a laugh, put his hand behind the ear of the little girl and pulled off the mask. And there was a little coal-black girl. She laughed. And I laughed too, but Grant Munro stood staring with his hand holding his throat.
My God!
He cried.
What does this mean?
I will tell you everything.
Cried his wife with a proud face.
You have forced me, and now we must both accept the situation. My husband died at Atlanta. My child survived.
Your child?
Cried Grant Munro. She pulled out a locket, and inside the locket was the picture of a very handsome and intelligent man, but a man who was obviously of African descent.
This is John Hebron of Atlanta,
said Mrs. Munro.
And he was a very noble man. I cut myself off from my race to marry him, but I never regretted it for a moment. Unfortunately, our only child took after his people rather than mine. She's very dark, but she is my dear little girl.
When the little girl heard these words, she ran to her mother.
I left her in America with a trusted servant,
Mrs. Munro continued.
because she was not very healthy, but I never considered abandoning her. When I met you by chance and learned to love you, I was afraid to tell you about my child. I was afraid to lose you. I kept her existence a secret from you for 3 years. But finally, I had to see my little girl. I sent the servant £100 and told her to come to this cottage. I took every possible precaution so that there would not be gossip about a little black girl. That is why she wore that yellow mask. You told me about her arrival in the cottage, and that night I had to see her, and that was the beginning of my troubles. And now, tonight, you know everything. What are you going to do about me and my child?
Mr. Grant Munro did not say anything for 2 minutes, and his answer was one of which I love to think. He lifted the little child, kissed her, and with the little girl in his arms, he gave his other hand to his wife.
We can talk it over more comfortably at home,
He said.
I am not a very good man, Effie, but I think that I am better than you thought.
We all left the cottage together, and then Holmes and I returned to London. We did not say another word about the case until late that night at Holmes's house in Baker Street, just before Holmes went to bed.
Watson,
He said,
if you should ever think that I am becoming too confident in my powers, or that I am not working hard enough on a particular case, please whisper Norbury in my ear, and I will be infinitely obliged to you. The Blue Carbuncle, Part 1.
I visited my friend Sherlock Holmes on the second morning of Christmas. When I arrived, he was sitting in front of the fire, wearing his purple dressing gown. Next to the sofa was a wooden chair, and on the chair was a dirty old hat. A magnifying glass and a forceps were on the chair, so the hat was probably part of one of Holmes's investigations. "You are busy," I said. "Perhaps I interrupt you."
Not at all.
He replied, and indicated the hat.
The problem is very simple, but it is still interesting and maybe even instructive.
I sat down in an armchair and warmed my hands in front of the fire because it was very cold outside. "I imagine," I said, "that this hat is connected with a terrible crime,"
No crime.
said Sherlock Holmes, laughing.
It is only one of those strange things that happens when 4 million human beings live within the small area of a city. With so many people, every imaginable combination of events is possible, and sometimes you can find a problem that is striking and strange, but not criminal. Do you know Peterson, the commissionaire?
Yes.
This trophy belongs to him.
It is his hat?
No. He found it. Its owner is unknown. Look at it carefully, and not as a dirty old hat, but as an intellectual problem. It arrived here on Christmas morning, together with a good fat goose. That goose is probably cooking at Peterson's house at this very moment. These are the facts. About 4 o'clock on Christmas morning, Peterson was returning from a party along Tottenham Court Road. In front of him, he saw a tall man carrying a white goose. Then he saw some men attack the tall man. One of the attackers knocked his hat off, so the man lifted his walking stick to defend himself. But when he lifted the stick, he broke a shop window by mistake. Peterson ran to help the man, but when the man saw Peterson with his commissionaire uniform, he thought he was a policeman, and he ran away, and so did the attackers. Peterson was there all alone, with the hat and the goose.
Of course, Peterson then returned the goose to its owner, I said.
No,
replied Holmes.
that is the problem. It is true that "For Mrs. Henry Baker" was written on a small card attached to the leg of the goose, and that the initials H.B. are written on the lining of the hat. But there are thousands of Bakers and hundreds of Henry Bakers in London.
What then did Peterson do?
He brought both the goose and the hat to me on Christmas morning, because he knows that I am interested in even the smallest problems. I kept the goose until this morning, and then I gave it to Peterson to cook for dinner.
Did the man who lost the goose put a notice in the newspaper?
No,
Then how can you discover who he is? I asked.
from his hat.
Replied Holmes. You are joking. What can you learn from this dirty old hat?
Here is my magnifying glass.
Replied Holmes.
You know my methods. Look at the hat and see what you can discover about the identity of the man.
I picked up the hat and looked at it carefully. It was a very ordinary, round, black hat. It was very worn, and inside I could see the initials H.B. There was a hole in the brim for the hat securer, but the elastic was missing. It was very dusty and spotted in several places, but the owner had tried to cover these spots with black ink. I can see nothing, I said, and gave the hat to Holmes.
On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything, but you do not reason with what you see.
Then please tell me what you can deduce from this hat, I said.
Well,
Said Holmes, as he looked at the hat carefully.
I can see that the man was highly intellectual, and that 3 years ago he had enough money, but recently he has had difficulties with money. He had foresight in the past, but much less now, which means he has some problem, probably drink. This is probably the reason why his wife has stopped loving him.
My dear Holmes,
He has, however, kept some self-respect.
continued Holmes.
He stays at home and goes out very little. He is totally out of training, is middle-aged, has grey hair which has been recently cut, and he uses lime cream. These are the main facts. Also, I do not think he has gas lighting in his house.
You are certainly joking, Holmes.
Not at all. Don't you understand how I inferred these things?
I am certain that I am very stupid, I replied, but I can't follow your reasoning. For example, how did you deduce that this man was an intellectual? To answer me, Holmes put the hat on his head. The hat was too big for him and covered his eyes.
It's a question of volume,
Said Holmes.
If a man has such a big brain, he must have something in it.
How do you know he has less money now than in the past?
This kind of hat first came out 3 years ago. It is a hat of the very best quality. If this man had enough money to buy such an expensive hat 3 years ago, but he has not bought another hat since then it is clear that he has much less money now.
Well, that is clear enough, certainly. But how about the foresight? Sherlock Holmes laughed.
Here is the foresight,
He said, pointing at the hat securer.
Hat securers are never sold with hats. This means that he ordered it, which is a certain sign of foresight. But since he has not replaced the broken elastic, this means that he has less foresight than before. But he has tried to hide some of these spots on his hat with ink, which means he has not completely lost his self-respect.
Your reasoning is certainly very good, I said.
That he is middle-aged, that his hair is grey, that his hair has been recently cut, and that he uses lime cream can all be seen by looking closely at the inside of the hat. With the magnifying glass you can see the partially grey hairs cut by a barber's scissors. They stick to the hat, and there is the distinct odour of lime cream. Also, you will observe that the dust on the hat is the soft brown dust you find in houses, not the hard grey dust you find in the streets. This means that the hat is kept inside the house most of the time, and that he doesn't go out very often. Also, you can see the sweat stain on the inside of the hat, which means he perspired a lot. A man who perspires so much can't be in the best of training.
But his wife? You said that she stopped loving him.
This hat has not been brushed for weeks. When a man's wife lets him go out in such bad condition, it means that she doesn't love him anymore.
But he could be a bachelor, I said.
No, he was bringing the goose to make peace with his wife. Do you remember the card on its leg?
You have an answer for everything. But how did you deduce that he doesn't have gas lighting in his house?
Well, if you saw 1 or 2 wax stains on a hat, it could be by chance. But I can see at least 5 on this hat, which means that this man must use candles very frequently.
Well, it is very ingenious, I said, laughing. But since a crime has not been committed, all this seems to be a waste of time.
Part 2.
Sherlock Holmes had opened his mouth to reply when the door opened and Peterson, the commissionaire, rushed in. He looked incredibly shocked.
"The goose, Mr. Holmes! The goose, sir!"
he cried.
What? Has it returned to life and flown out of your kitchen window?
Said Holmes.
"Look here, sir! Look what my wife found in its stomach!"
He showed us a shiny blue stone in his hand.
By Jove, Peterson,
said Holmes.
this is a treasure. Do you know what you have got?
"A diamond, sir. A precious stone. It cuts glass like butter."
It is more than a precious stone. It's the precious stone.
Not the Countess of Morcar's blue carbuncle that was stolen, I cried.
Precisely so,
responded Holmes.
And here is the newspaper article that tells the story. Hotel Cosmopolitan jewel robbery. John Horner, a 26-year-old plumber, has been arrested for stealing the famous blue carbuncle from the Countess of Morcar. James Ryder, an attendant at the hotel, said that he had sent Horner to the Countess's room on the day of the robbery to repair a bar of the grate. Ryder said that he stayed with Horner for a few minutes, but then he had to leave. When Ryder returned, he saw that somebody had forced open the Countess's bureau. Ryder called the police, and the police arrested Horner that same evening. Catherine Cusack, the Countess's maid, said that she heard Ryder call for help. She ran into the room and saw the same things that Ryder described to the police. In addition, the police discovered that Horner had already been charged with robbery in the past, but Horner says that in this case he is innocent. His trial will be soon. So much for the police report,
said Holmes, throwing the paper on a chair.
You see, Watson, our little deductions about the hat have become much more important and less innocent. Here is the stone. The stone came from the goose, and the goose came from Mr. Henry Baker, the gentleman with the bad hat which we examined so carefully. Now we must discover Mr. Baker's part in this mystery. To find him, the simplest thing is to put an advertisement in the evening newspaper.
What will you say? I asked.
Well,
said Holmes,
Found at the corner of Goodge Street, a goose and a black hat. Mr. Henry Baker can have them if he comes to 221B Baker Street at 6:30 this evening.
Then Holmes sent Peterson to buy another goose to give to Baker if he came, and to put the advertisement in all the newspapers. I left to work for the day. That evening, when I returned, I saw a tall man wearing a Scotch hat waiting outside Holmes's house. We entered together.
Mr. Henry Baker, I believe,
said Holmes when he saw us.
Please sit by the fire and get warm. Ah, Watson, you have come at the right time. Is that your hat, Mr. Baker?
Yes, sir. That is certainly my hat.
We have kept your things,
said Holmes.
but we had to eat the goose.
You ate it?
Said our visitor with excitement.
Yes, it was going to go bad. But I bought you another goose. It is over there, and I think it is just as good.
Oh, certainly, certainly,
answered Mr. Baker with relief.
Of course,
said Holmes.
We have the feathers, legs, and stomach of your bird, if you want them.
The man laughed loudly.
Perhaps I could keep them to remember my adventure, but no, I don't need them. Thank you, but I will take this goose and go.
There is your hat, then, and there is your bird,
said Holmes.
By the way, could you tell me where you got your goose from? It was a splendid bird, and I would like to get another one like it.
Certainly, sir,
said Mr. Baker.
I got it at the Alpha Inn near the museum. You see, the owner of the inn, Mr. Windigate, started a goose club. Each week we gave him a few pence, and then at Christmas we received a goose.
After this, Mr. Henry Baker picked up his hat and goose and left.
So much for Mr. Henry Baker,
said Holmes when Baker had gone. We decided to go immediately to the Alpha Inn to investigate the goose. At the Alpha Inn, we discovered that the goose had come from a salesman called Mr. Breckinridge in Covent Garden. So, once again, Holmes and I put on our coats and walked to Covent Garden to talk to Mr. Breckinridge.
Remember,
said Holmes as we walked to Covent Garden,
at one end of this chain of events we have a simple goose. But at the other end of the chain there is a man who will go to prison for 7 years if we cannot show that he is innocent.
We soon found Mr. Breckinridge's stall, and Holmes asked him about his geese. I was surprised when Mr. Breckinridge replied angrily to Holmes's questions.
I have had enough. I am tired of people asking me, where are the geese, and who did you sell the geese to, and how much money do you want for the geese? Enough!
With a little bit of difficulty, Holmes finally got the information we needed. The geese had come from Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road. We were walking away when we heard shouting from Mr. Breckinridge's stall. We turned round and saw a little man in front of the stall.
I've had enough of you and your geese. If you come here again, my dog will attack you,
shouted Mr. Breckinridge at the little man. The little man started walking away, and Holmes and I went after him. Holmes put his hand on the man's shoulder. The little man turned around and looked frightened. He said,
Who are you? What do you want?
Excuse me,
said Holmes,
but I heard you talking to the goose salesman, and I think I can help you.
You? Who are you? How could you know anything about the matter?
My name is Sherlock Holmes. It is my business to know what other people don't know.
But do you know anything about this?
Excuse me, I know everything about this. You are trying to find some geese, which were sold by Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road to a salesman called Breckinridge, who then sold them to Mr. Windigate at the Alpha Inn, who then gave one of them to a member of his goose club called Mr. Henry Baker.
You are the man I wanted to meet,
said the little man, whose name, as we then discovered, was John Ryder. Yes, John Ryder, the man who had called the police to report the stolen blue carbuncle. We then returned to Holmes's house to discuss the matter in front of a warm fire.
Here we are,
said Holmes happily as we entered his room.
Now, do you want to know what happened to those geese?
Yes, sir.
Replied Ryder.
But you really want to know what happened to that goose, the white one, with a black bar across its tail?
Ryder shook with emotion.
Oh, sir,
He cried.
where did it go?
It came here.
Here?
Yes, and it was an incredible bird. I'm not surprised that you want to find that goose. It laid an egg after it died, the brightest little blue egg that you have ever seen. I have it here in my museum.
Our visitor stood up and then almost fell down. Holmes took out the blue carbuncle, and Ryder stared at it. He did not know if he should say it was his or not.
The game is up, Ryder. I know almost exactly what happened. Because you worked at the Hotel Cosmopolitan, you knew that the Countess of Morcar had the blue carbuncle in her room.
It was the Countess's maid, Catherine Cusack, who told me about it.
I see,
continued Holmes.
So you and Catherine Cusack broke the grate in the Countess's room so that Horner had to come and repair it. You knew that Horner had had a part in a robbery before, so that he would be blamed for this one. Then, when Horner had finished repairing the grate, you called the police and the unfortunate man was arrested. You then...
Ryder threw himself onto the rug and held on to Holmes's knees.
For God's sake, have mercy! Think of my father! Think of Mother! It would break their hearts!
Get back into your chair,
said Holmes sternly.
It is easy to say that now, but you did not think of this poor Horner before.
I will go away, Mr. Holmes, and without my testimony, Horner will be free.
We will talk about that next,
said Holmes.
And now tell us how the blue carbuncle came into the goose, and how the goose came into the open market. Tell us the truth, because that is your only chance not to go to prison.
Ryder moved his tongue over his dry lips and began his story.
I will tell you exactly what happened. After I had the blue carbuncle, I was terrified. I did not know where to go. I thought I saw the police everywhere. Finally, I decided to go to my sister's. My sister married a man called Oakshott and lives on Brixton Road, where she fattens geese for the market. When I arrived, she asked me what was wrong. I told her that I was upset about the robbery at the hotel. I then went out into the backyard where the geese are and smoked a pipe. I had a friend called Maudsley who had been in prison. He had told me how thieves sold stolen property, so I decided to go to him with the blue carbuncle. However, I did not know how I could carry the blue carbuncle to his house. Then I had the idea to force one of the geese to swallow the stone. My sister had told me that I could have one of the geese for Christmas. So I caught one of the geese, a big white one with a barred tail, and forced open its beak and pushed the stone in with my finger. The goose then swallowed the stone. Then I told my sister that I wanted my Christmas goose then. She thought it was a bit strange, but in the end she said I could have the goose. Unfortunately, while I was talking to my sister, the goose escaped and went in the middle of the flock with the other geese. I caught it again, killed it, and took it to my friend Maudsley. I told him the story. We then cut open the goose, but we could not find the stone. I ran back to my sister and asked her if there were any other white geese with barred tails. She said that there were 2 other ones, but she had sold them to the dealer called Breckenridge of Covent Garden. I went to him, and he told me that he had sold them all. You heard him tonight. Now I will be considered a thief, and I have not even touched the blue carbuncle. God help me!"
There was a moment of silence, and then Holmes got up and opened the door.
Get out!
Shouted Holmes.
"What, sir? Oh, thank you!"
Cried Ryder.
No more words. Get out!
And there were no more words. Ryder ran out of the room and out of the house.
After all, Watson,
Said Holmes, reaching for his pipe.
if the police can't catch their own criminals, I don't have to do it for them. Also, this Ryder will never commit another crime again. He is too frightened. Besides, this is the season of forgiveness. Chance has given us an incredibly interesting little problem, and its solution should satisfy us. And now, Doctor, we shall begin another investigation, in which a bird is also the most important part. Our dinner. A Case of Identity. Part 1. My dear fellow,
Said Sherlock Holmes, as we sat by the fire in his house at Baker Street.
real life is infinitely stranger than anything we could invent. We would not dare invent things which are commonplace things of life. If we could go out of that window, fly over this great city, gently remove the roofs of houses, and look at the peculiar things that are happening, the strange coincidences, the plans, and the wonderful chains of events, we would discover things much more interesting than in books.
But I do not believe it, I answered. The stories in the newspapers are never very interesting. In fact, they are always very boring.
That is because,
Said Holmes,
newspapers always repeat the official reports of magistrates and police reports. You can be certain that there is nothing as unnatural and strange as the commonplace.
I know, I replied, that your cases are always very interesting. But let us look at today's newspaper. I picked up the newspaper and began to read an article. It was about a husband who was cruel to his wife. I don't have to read the article, I said, but I am sure that the man had a girlfriend, that he drank, and that he began to hit his wife. I am also sure that there was a sympathetic sister, or landlady.
You have chosen a bad example, Watson,
Said Holmes.
because I have worked on this case. The man, Mr. Dundas, did not have a girlfriend, and he did not drink, and he did not hit her. Instead, at the end of every meal, he took out his false teeth and threw them at his wife. You must admit that nobody could invent such a story.
Do you have any interesting cases now? I asked.
Well, I am working on 10 or 12 cases, but none of them are interesting. They are important, you understand, without being interesting. I have found that unimportant matters are usually more interesting. If there is a big crime, the motive is generally obvious. So they are generally not very interesting. But I think I will have an interesting case in a few minutes.
Holmes was standing at the window and looking down at the dull, grey London streets. There was a woman standing in the street. She was moving her hands nervously. It was obvious that she could not make up her mind. Then suddenly she ran across the road and rang Holmes's doorbell.
I know those symptoms,
Said Holmes.
When a woman hesitates like that on the pavement, it means that she has a love problem. She wants help, but she thinks that her problem is too delicate to communicate. But when a woman does not hesitate and rings the doorbell hard, it means she was seriously wronged. In this case, this woman is confused and perplexed, and wants an explanation.
As Holmes was speaking, the servant announced Miss Mary Sutherland. She was a large woman. She wore a hat with a red feather, a black jacket, a dark brown dress, and grey gloves. She also wore small, round gold earrings. When Holmes saw her, he said,
"Isn't it difficult for you to type with such bad eyesight?"
I thought so at first,
Miss Sutherland replied.
but now I can type without looking at the keys.
Then she looked surprised and frightened when she understood that Holmes already knew so much about her.
How do you know that?
Asked Miss Sutherland.
"It is my business to know things,"
Said Holmes, laughing.
"If I could not see these things, why would people come to me? In any case, I can see the marks of the glasses on your nose."
I have come here
She said.
because I want to know where Mr. Hosmer Angel has gone.
"Why did you come here in such a hurry?"
Asked Holmes. Once again, Miss Sutherland looked very surprised. Holmes then explained that her boots were not the same, and that they were not completely buttoned.
Yes, I did hurry out of the house because I was angry at Mr. Windybank, that is my father. He did not want to ask the police about Mr. Angel. He said that nothing bad had happened. This made me angry, so I came here to see you.
"Your father?"
Said Holmes.
"He must be your stepfather, because his surname is different from yours."
Yes, my stepfather. I call him father, even though that seems strange to me. You see, he is only 5 years older than me.
"And is your mother alive?"
Asked Holmes.
Oh, yes, mother is alive and well.
Answered Miss Sutherland.
But I was not happy when she married Mr. Windybank so soon after father died. Also, Mr. Windybank is 15 years younger than mother. Father was a plumber and had a good business, and when he died, mother continued the business. But when she married Mr. Windybank, he made her sell it.
"Do you live on the money from the business?"
Asked Holmes.
Oh, no.
Replied Miss Sutherland.
I inherited some money from my uncle. I cannot touch it, but with the interest I receive £100 a year.
"That should be enough for you to live quite comfortably,"
Said Holmes.
I give that money to mother, and I live on the money I make typing.
She replied.
"Now, can you tell us about Mr. Hosmer Angel?"
Asked Holmes. Miss Sutherland blushed deeply and said,
I met him at the plumber's ball. They used to send tickets to my father when he was alive, and after he died they sent them to my mother. But Mr. Windybank didn't want us to go. He said that my father's friends were not good enough for us. But the day of the ball, Mr. Windybank went to France on business, so Mother and I went to the ball, and it was there I met Mr. Angel.
"I suppose,"
said Holmes,
"that Mr. Windybank was very angry with you when he discovered that you had gone to the ball."
No, not very.
replied Miss Sutherland.
He said that it was impossible to stop a woman when she really wanted something.
"And did you see Mr. Hosmer after the ball?"
Asked Holmes.
Yes, but he couldn't come to the house when Father was there. Father didn't want anybody to come to the house. So Mr. Hosmer said,
We should wait until your father goes to France before we see each other. In the meantime, we can write to each other every day.
"Were you engaged to the gentleman at this time?"
Asked Holmes.
Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes. We were engaged after the first walk that we took. Mr. Angel worked in an office in Leadenhall Street.
"Which office?"
That's the worst part. I don't know.
"Then where did you send your letters?"
To the Leadenhall Street post office where he got them. He said to me,
The other workers in my office will make fun of me if they see my letters.
I told him that I could type my letters like he did his, but he said,
A typed letter comes from an impersonal machine and not from you.
This shows how fond he was of me, Mr. Holmes, and the nice little things he thought of.
It was most suggestive,
said Holmes.
I have always said that the little things are infinitely the most important. Can you remember any other little things about Mr. Hosmer Angel?
He was a very shy man, Mr. Holmes. He always wanted to walk with me in the evening instead of during the day. He was very gentlemanly. Even his voice was gentle. He told me that he had had a bad infection of the tonsils when he was a child, so he had to whisper. He always wore elegant clothes. His eyes were weak, just like mine, and he wore dark glasses against the sun.
Well, what happened when Mr. Windybank returned to France?
Asked Holmes.
Mr. Angel came to my house and said that we should get married before Father returned. He was very serious and said,
"Put your hand on the Bible and promise me that you will always love me."
Mother agreed with him. Mother liked him from the beginning, and liked him even more than I did. When they started talking about our getting married within the week, I asked them if I should ask Father first. They said no. I, however, did not want to do anything in secret, so I wrote to Father at his office in France. But the letter came back to me on the very day of the wedding.
It missed him, then?
Yes, sir. He had started back to England just before the letter arrived in France.
Ha! That was unfortunate. Your wedding was planned, then, for the Friday of that week. Was it to be in church?
Yes, sir, but very quietly. On the day of the wedding, Hosmer came in a hansom to take Mother and me to the church. But since there were two of us, Mother and I went in the hansom, and Hosmer took a cab. We got to the church first, and when the cab arrived, we waited for him to come out. But he never did. The cabman said that he could not understand what had happened to him.
I think that you have been very badly treated,
said Holmes.
Oh, no, sir. Hosmer was too good and kind to leave so. Why, all morning before the wedding he said to me,
"If anything happens to me, you must always love me. You must wait for me. I will return to you."
I thought this very strange to say on the day of our wedding, but his disappearance explains everything.
It certainly does,
said Holmes.
In your opinion, did he know that he was in danger?
Yes, I think so.
But do you know what the danger was?
No, I don't.
One more question. How did your mother react?
She was angry and told me that I should never speak about him again.
And your father? Did you tell him?
Yes. He said,
"Something terrible has happened to Hosmer, but he will return."
I agree with my father. Why would Hosmer leave me? After all, there was no money involved. Hosmer did not borrow money from me, and I never put the money which I had inherited in his name. So he did not take my money and leave.
Then she pulled out a handkerchief and began to cry.
I will try to solve your problem,
said Holmes.
But don't think about it any more. Forget about Mr. Angel.
Do you think that I will ever see him again?
No, I'm afraid not.
Then what has happened to him?
You will leave the question with me. Now, I need some of Mr. Angel's letters, a good description of him, and also your father's address.
I never had Mr. Angel's address,
said Miss Sutherland.
But here is Mr. Windybank's address. He works for a wine importer. Here is the advertisement with a description of Hosmer that I put in the newspaper, the Chronicle.
Miss Sutherland then left, but before leaving she said,
I will always wait for Hosmer Angel to return.
Part 2.
When she had left, I asked Holmes about the case.
The young woman is quite interesting, but her little problem is not very difficult or unusual. Would you mind reading me the description of Hosmer Angel?
I then read it to Holmes. Missing, a gentleman called Hosmer Angel. About 5'7" tall. He's strongly built with black hair, black sideboards, and moustache. He's a little bald in the centre. He wears dark glasses, and he's got a speech defect. He has got a sallow complexion. He was wearing a black coat, black waistcoat, grey trousers, and brown boots. Please contact Miss Sutherland, etc., etc.
That is enough,
said Holmes.
Now, look at these letters, which Hosmer wrote to her. What do you see?
They are typed, I said.
Not only that, but the signature is typed too. The point about the signature is very suggestive. In fact, we can call it conclusive.
Of what?
My dear fellow, can't you see how important this fact is to the case?
No, I can't, I replied. Unless Hosmer didn't sign his letters because he didn't want to be legally responsible for what he promised.
No, that was not the point,
said Holmes.
But now I will write 2 letters which will solve this mystery. One of the letters is to Mr. Windybank's firm in the city, and the other one will be to Mr. Windybank himself, to ask him to come here to meet us tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock.
A few minutes before 6 the next day, I returned to Baker Street. When I walked in, Holmes was doing chemistry experiments. Well, have you solved it? I said as I walked into the room.
Yes, it was the bisulfate of baryta.
No! Miss Sutherland's mystery, I cried.
Oh, that. I thought you were asking me about the chemistry experiment. There was never any mystery in the matter. The only problem is that the scoundrel did not do anything illegal, so he can't be punished.
Who was Hosmer Angel, and why did he abandon Miss Sutherland? But Holmes did not have time to answer me, because just then we heard someone knock at the door. And then someone walking towards Holmes's room.
This is the girl's stepfather. He wrote to me to say that he was coming,
said Holmes. The man who entered the room was a strongly built fellow without sideboards or moustache, with a sallow complexion, and he looked at us with a pair of penetrating grey eyes. He was wearing a black top hat.
Good evening, Mr. James Windybank,
said Holmes.
I believe this is the typed letter that you wrote to me to say that you were coming here.
Yes, sir. I am sorry that Miss Sutherland has troubled you about this little problem. Also, I don't like other people knowing about our family misfortune. Anyway, I don't think that you will ever find this Hosmer Angel.
On the contrary,
said Holmes quietly.
I am almost certain that I will find him.
Mr. Windybank started violently and dropped his gloves.
I am happy to hear that,
he said.
It is a curious thing,
remarked Holmes,
that a typewriter is just as distinctive as a man's handwriting. For example, in this letter of yours, I can see that this part of the R has a slight defect. There are also 14 other characteristics of your typewriter.
We write all the letters in the office with this typewriter,
said Mr. Windybank.
And now,
continued Holmes,
I will show you what is really very interesting. In fact, I'm thinking about writing a book on the typewriter and its relation to crime.
Mr. Windybank jumped out of his chair and picked up his hat.
I cannot waste time over this ridiculous talk. If you can catch the man, catch him, and let me know when you have caught him.
Certainly,
said Holmes, walking over to the door and locking it.
I let you know that I have caught him.
What? Where?
Shouted Mr. Windybank, becoming white and looking around like a rat in a trap.
You can't get away, Mr. Windybank,
said Holmes.
This case was really very easy. Now, sit down and we can talk about it.
Mr. Windybank fell back into the chair.
I did not do anything illegal,
he stammered.
I am afraid that you are right. But, Mr. Windybank, it was a cruel, selfish, and heartless trick. Now, let us look at what happened,
said Holmes. Then Holmes sat down and began to talk.
The man marries a woman older than himself for her money. He can also use the money of the daughter as long as the daughter lives with him and the mother. The daughter has a lot of money, so it is important not to lose it. But the daughter is friendly and affectionate, so it is clear that she will soon find a husband. At first, this man tells the daughter that she cannot go out, but this will not solve the problem forever. Then one day the daughter says that she wants to go to a ball. What does the clever stepfather do then? With the help of the wife, he disguises himself. He wears dark glasses and puts on a fake moustache. Then he changes his voice and speaks very softly. He is even more certain that his plan will work because the girl is short-sighted. Then at the ball, this man keeps away other lovers by becoming the girl's lover himself.
It was just a joke at first,
groaned Mr. Windybank.
We didn't think that the girl would fall in love.
Yes, that is probably true,
continued Holmes.
But the girl really fell in love, and you decided to take the situation to the extreme. You began to see her often, and the mother said that she liked him very much. Then you decided to ask Miss Sutherland to marry you, so that she would never again think about other men. But it was difficult for you to pretend to go to France every time Miss Sutherland had to see Mr. Angel. You had to end the situation dramatically. In some way, you had to keep Miss Sutherland from thinking about other men in the future. Therefore, you made her promise on the Bible, and you told her that something could happen on the very morning of the wedding. You took her to the church, but obviously you could not marry her. You disappeared by using the old trick of entering one door of a cab and walking out the other. I think this is the chain of events, Mr. Windybank.
Yes, maybe that is true,
replied Mr. Windybank.
But I did not do anything illegal. And now you are breaking the law because you will not let me leave this room.
You are right. You did not do anything illegal,
said Holmes, as he unlocked and opened the door.
But you really deserve to be punished, and I would like to do it.
Then Holmes picked up a riding crop, but Mr. Windybank ran out of the door and out of the house.
Now he certainly is a cold-blooded scoundrel,
said Holmes, laughing.
That fellow will continue doing worse and worse crimes until he does something really bad and finishes on the gallows. In any case, this case had some interesting points.
I cannot completely follow your reasoning in this case, I said.
Well, it was clear from the first that Mr. Hosmer Angel had a very good reason for his actions, and that the only man who could really profit from the situation was the stepfather. He wanted to keep the £100 a year. Then it was very suggestive that Mr. Windybank and Mr. Hosmer Angel were never together. And so were the dark glasses, the soft voice, and the moustache. They all suggested a disguise. The final point was the typed signature. This made me think that the handwriting of the man must be very familiar to Miss Sutherland, and that if she saw even a small portion of it, she would recognize it.
And how did you verify these ideas? I asked.
First, I wrote to Mr. Windibank's firm. In the letter, I described Mr. Angel after I had eliminated everything that could be a disguise, like the glasses, the moustache, and the voice, and I asked them if they had an employee like that. They wrote back to me and said that I had described Mr. James Windibank. Then I wrote to Mr. Windibank to invite him here, and as I expected, he typed his reply to me. Then I compared his letter with the letters of Mr. Angel. Voilà tout.
And Miss Sutherland? I asked.
If I tell her, she will not believe me,
replied Holmes.
Maybe you remember this Persian saying, "It is dangerous to take a tiger cub from its mother, and it is dangerous to take a delusion from a woman."
The Speckled Band. Chapter 1. Helen's Story. At the time of this story, I was still living at my friend Sherlock Holmes's flat in Baker Street in London. Very early one morning, a young woman dressed in black came to see us. She looked tired and unhappy, and her face was very white. "I'm afraid of death, Mr. Holmes," she cried. "Please help me. I'm not 30 yet, and look at my grey hair. I'm so afraid." "Just sit down and tell us your story," said Holmes kindly. "My name is Helen Stoner," she began, "and I live with my stepfather, Dr. Grimesby Roylott, near a village in the country. His family was once very rich, but they had no money when my stepfather was born. So he studied to be a doctor and went out to India. He met and married my mother there when my sister Julia and I were very young. Our father was dead, you see." "Your mother had some money, perhaps?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "Oh, yes, Mother had a lot of money, so my stepfather wasn't poor any more." "Tell me more about him, Miss Stoner," said Holmes. "Well, he's a violent man. In India he once got angry with his Indian servant and killed him. He had to go to prison because of that, and then we all came back to England. Mother died in an accident 8 years ago, so my stepfather got all her money. But if Julia or I marry, he must pay us £250 every year." "And now you live with him in the country," said Holmes. "Yes, but he stays at home and never sees anybody, Mr. Holmes," answered Helen Stoner. "He's more and more violent now, and sometimes has fights with the people from the village. Everybody's afraid of him now, and they run away when they see him. And they're also afraid of his Indian wild animals, which run freely around the garden. A friend sends them to him from India, and the animals are not the only wild things in the garden. There are also gypsies. My stepfather likes these wild people, and they can come and go where they like. Poor Julia and I had very unhappy lives. We had no servants. They always left because they were afraid of my stepfather, and we had to do all the work in the house. Julia was only 30 when she died, and her hair was already grey, like my hair now." "When did she die?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "She died 2 years ago, and that's why I'm here. We never met anybody in the country, but sometimes we visited some of my family who live near London." There, Julia met a young man who asked to marry her. My stepfather agreed, but soon after this, she died. Miss Stoner put her hand over her eyes and cried for a minute. Sherlock Holmes was listening with his eyes closed, but now he opened them and looked at Helen Stoner. "Tell me everything about her death," he said. "I can remember it all very well. It was a terrible time," she answered. "Our 3 bedrooms are all downstairs. First there is my stepfather's room. Julia's room is next to his, and my room is next to Julia's. The rooms all have windows on the garden side of the house, and doors which open into the corridor. One evening, our stepfather was smoking his strong Indian cigarettes in his room. Julia couldn't sleep because she could smell them in her room. So she came into my room to talk to me. Before she went back to bed, she said to me, 'Helen, have you ever heard a whistle in the middle of the night?' I was surprised. 'No,' I said. 'It's strange,' she said. 'Sometimes I hear a whistle, but I don't know where it comes from. Why don't you hear it?' I laughed and said, 'I sleep better than you do.' So Julia went to her room and locked the door after her." "Why did you lock your doors?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "We were afraid of the wild animals and the gypsies," she answered. "Please go on," said Holmes. "I couldn't sleep that night. It was a very stormy night, with a lot of wind and rain. Suddenly, I heard a woman scream. It was my sister's voice. I ran into the corridor, and just then I heard a whistle, and a minute later the sound of falling metal. I didn't know what it was. I ran to my sister's door. She opened it and fell to the ground. Her face was white and afraid, and she was crying. "Help me! Help me, Helen! I'm ill! I'm dying!" I put my arms around her, and she cried out in a terrible voice, "Helen! Oh, my God, Helen! It was the band! The speckled band!" She wanted to say more, but she couldn't. I called my stepfather, who tried to help her, but we could do nothing. And so my dear, dear sister died. "Are you sure about the whistle and the sound of falling metal?" asked Holmes. "I think so," answered Helen. "But it was a very wild, stormy night. Perhaps I made a mistake. The police couldn't understand why my sister died. Her door was locked, and nobody could get into her room. They didn't find any poison in her body. And what was the speckled band? Gypsies wear something like that round their necks. I think she died because she was so afraid. But I don't know what she was afraid of. Perhaps it was the gypsies. What do you think, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes thought for a minute. He said. "That is a difficult question. But please go on." "That was 2 years ago," Helen Stoner said. I have been very lonely without my sister. But a month ago, a dear friend asked me to marry him. My stepfather has agreed, and so we're going to marry soon. But 2 days ago, I had to move to my sister's old bedroom, because some men are mending my bedroom wall. And last night, I heard that whistle again. I ran out of the house immediately and came to London to ask for your help. Please help me, Mr. Holmes. I don't want to die like Julia.
We must move fast, said Holmes. If we go to your house today, can we look at these rooms? But your stepfather must not know.
He's in London today, so he won't see you. Oh, thank you, Mr. Holmes. I feel better already.
Chapter 2. Holmes and Watson visit the house. Holmes went out for the morning, but he came back at lunchtime. We then went by train into the country, and took a taxi to Dr. Roylott's house. You see, said Holmes to me, our dangerous friend Roylott needs the girl's money because he only has £750 a year from his dead wife. I found that out this morning. But the gypsies, the whistle, the band, they are more difficult to understand. But I think I have an answer. When we arrived, Helen Stoner showed us the 3 bedrooms. We saw her room first. Why are they mending your bedroom wall? Asked Holmes. There's nothing wrong with it.
You're right, she said. I think it was a plan to move me into my sister's room.
Yes, said Holmes. We went into Julia's room, and Holmes looked at the windows carefully. Nobody could come in from outside, he said. Then he looked round the room. Why is that bell rope there, just over the bed?
My stepfather put it there 2 years ago. It's for calling a servant. But Julia and I never used it, because we didn't have any servants. He also put in that air vent on the wall between his room and this one.
Holmes pulled the rope. But it doesn't work, he said. How strange. And it's just over the air vent. That also is interesting. Why have an air vent on an inside wall? Air vents are usually on outside walls. Then we went into Dr. Roylott's room. Holmes saw a large metal box near the wall.
My stepfather keeps business papers in there, said Helen.
Does he keep a cat in there too? Asked Holmes. Look.
There was some milk on a plate on top of the box.
Now, Miss Stoner, he said, I think your life is in danger. Tonight, my friend Watson and I must spend the night in your sister's room, where you are sleeping at the moment.
Helen Stoner and I looked at him in surprise.
Yes, we must, he went on. We'll take a room in a hotel in the village. When your stepfather goes to bed, put a light in your sister's bedroom window and leave it open. Then go into your old room, and we'll get into your sister's room through the window. We'll wait for the sound of the whistle and the falling metal.
How did my sister die, Mr. Holmes? Do you know? Please tell me, said Helen.
She put her hand on Sherlock Holmes's arm. I must find out more before I tell you, Miss Stoner. Now, goodbye, and don't be afraid, replied Sherlock Holmes.
We walked to the village, and Holmes said to me, "Tonight will be dangerous, Watson. Roylott is a very violent man." "But if I can help, Holmes, I shall come with you," I said. "Thank you, Watson. I'll need your help. Did you see the bell rope and the air vent? I knew about the air vent before we came. Of course there is a hole between the two rooms. That explains why Helen's sister could smell Dr. Roylott's cigarette." "My dear Holmes, how clever of you!" I cried. "And did you see the bed? It's fixed to the floor. She can't move it. It must stay under the rope, which is near the air vent." "Holmes," I cried, "I begin to understand. What a terrible crime!" "Yes, this doctor is a very clever man. But we can stop him, I think, Watson." Chapter 3. Death in the Night. That night we went back to the house. When we saw Helen Stoner's light, Holmes and I got in quietly through the window. Then we waited silently, in the middle bedroom, in the dark. We waited for 3 hours. He did not move. Suddenly we saw a light and heard a sound from Dr. Roylott's room. But nothing happened, and again we waited in the dark. Then there was another sound, a very quiet sound. Immediately Holmes jumped up and hit the bell rope hard. "Can you see it, Watson?" he shouted. But I saw nothing. There was a quiet whistle. We both looked up at the air vent, and suddenly we heard a terrible cry in the next room. Then the house was silent again. "What does it mean?" I asked. My voice was shaking. "It's finished," answered Holmes. "Let's go and see." We went into Dr. Roylott's room. The metal box was open. Roylott was sitting on a chair. His eyes were fixed on the air vent. Round his head was a strange yellow speckled band. He was dead. "The band, the speckled band," said Holmes very quietly. The band moved and began to turn its head. "Be careful, Watson. It's a snake. An Indian snake, and its poison can kill very quickly," Holmes cried. "Roylott died immediately. We must put the snake back in its box." Very, very carefully, Holmes took the snake and threw it into the metal box. "But how did you know about the snake, Holmes?" I asked. "At first, Watson, I thought that it was the gypsies. But then I understood. I thought that perhaps something came through the air vent, down the bell rope, and onto the bed. Then there was the milk. And, of course, snakes drink milk. It was easy for the doctor to get Indian animals. And because he was a doctor, he knew that this snake's poison is difficult to find in a dead body. So, every night he put the snake through the air vent, and it went down the bell rope onto the bed. Of course, nobody must see the snake, so every night he whistled to call it back. The sound of metal falling was the door of the metal box, which was the snake's home. Perhaps the snake came through the air vent many times before it killed Julia. But in the end, it killed her. And Helen, too, nearly died because of this snake. But tonight, when I hit the snake on the rope, it was angry and went back through the air vent. And so it killed the doctor. I'm not sorry about that. Soon after this, Helen Stoner married her young man and tried to forget the terrible deaths of her sister and stepfather. But she never really forgot the speckled band.